Hi, this is Tuba Tanyer Erdemir, and I am the coordinator of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. Welcome to our expert webinar, Tehran's Accomplices, threats that the Islamic Republic of Iran's proxies pose on the Middle East minorities. At this time, I would like to introduce ADL's Senior Vice President for International Affairs, Marina Rosenberg.
Thank you, Tuba, and thank you to all those joining us for this important webinar. Since its establishment in 1913, ADL has been committed to its timeless mission of stopping the defamation of Jewish people and securing justice and fair treatment to all. Consistent with this founding vision, in 2018, ADL launched its Task Force on Middle East Minorities to bring international attention to the human rights offenses committed against vulnerable minority communities in the broader Middle East by illiberal governments or extremists.
Oh, okay.
The task force is committed to advocating for religious, ethnic, sexual, and gender minorities through a nonpartisan campaign of activism, government outreach, bridge building, and awareness raising. This task is even more important in a post-October 7th world, when extremism and anti-Semitism is on the rise globally, and threats to vulnerable communities is more pronounced than ever in the Middle East. The Islamic Republic of Iran is not only the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism and anti-Semitism, but also the top threat to vulnerable communities in the Middle East, within Iran itself and through the armed proxies it funds and trains. The clerical regime's terrorist proxies, including Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi Taiba Hezbollah, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, among others, threaten peace and coexistence in the region. Tehran's tactics include assassinations, kidnapping, ransom, intimidation of minorities, and hijacking of electoral processes. In the post-October 7th world, understanding the destabilizing role the clerical regime and its terrorist proxies plays in the Middle East is more crucial than ever. That is probably true even given the weekend's news about the election of the so-called reformist president, Masoud Pezeshkian. Just a week ago, ADL filed a federal lawsuit alleging Iran, Syria, and North Korea provided material support to Hamas that enabled it to commit atrocities in Israel on October 7th, 2023, that killed, injured, and terrorized scores of US citizens and their families, and seeking financial compensation under applicable federal and local laws. Our message is clear. Iran, Syria, and North Korea must be held responsible for their roles in the largest anti-Semitic attack since the Holocaust. In this webinar, experts and human rights advocates will expose Tehran's long arm in the Middle East and the obstacles the Islamic Republic poses to building peaceful coexistence, prosperous societies, and respect for minorities in the region and beyond. Carol Nouriel, ADL Senior Regional Director of Israel, the Middle East, and North Africa, will moderate this panel. Carol, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Marina and Tuba. Let me introduce our panelists. So Dr. Eyal Hulata is the former Israeli National Security Advisor and head of the National Security Council, currently Senior International Fellow at FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Shadi Martini is the Chief Executive Director of Multifaith Alliance, and we have the pleasure of having Shadi serve as the co-chair of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. Marjan Kapoor Greenblatt is the founder and director of Alliance for Rights of All Minorities and is a member of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and a member of ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities, actually the newest member, so welcome, Behnam. We're honored to have you with us today to join our discussion on Islamic Republic of Iran's proxies and the threat that they pose on Middle East minorities. And that issue is very timely for all of us, Israelis and American alike. So, Behnam, we'll start with you. Can you describe how Iran's proxy forces and ragtag regional terrorists came to form what is called the Axis of Resistance? How is the Islamic Republic of Iran attempting to use the Axis as part and parcel of its anti-Israel strategy? And what are the goals of these proxies? Are they religious? Are they national? Are they both?
Thank you so much, Carol. It's a pleasure to be with you, Tuba, Marina, Marjan, Shadi, Eyal, and to all those tuning in virtually for today. The Axis of Resistance is basically a constellation of terror, proxy, and militia forces that the Islamic Republic has either created in places like Lebanon, such as Hezbollah, or in Iraq, such as Badr, or co-opted out of existing forces, such as the Houthis in Yemen or Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And ultimately, these are anti-status quo, violent terrorist organizations that by empowering through material and political and financial support, the Islamic Republic is able to serve and use as the long arm of its foreign and security policy. Now, this is not the normal foreign and security policy of any regular nation state. This is part and parcel of the ideological 4+ decades now of what the regime calls the export of the Islamic Revolution, a goal to kind of create mini terror organizations that can be scaled up over time into mini Islamic republics across the region. This ragtag coalition, really since the vacuums created by the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, the Arab Spring, and most recently the Syrian Civil War, have been built on a foundation of failed states in the Middle East, allowing the Islamic Republic to pry on downtrodden and dispossessed peoples in conflict zones and be able to use them and train them, equip them using the tip of the spear of the Islamic Republic's terrorist apparatus, which is a designated terrorist organization in at least 2 countries, the US and Canada, and that's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And there's different approaches and different tactics to using this axis. Some of them are formal, conventional warfighting forces. Some of them are cannon fodder in support of other forces. Some of them are your classic terror forces that smuggle weapons, that proliferate narcotics, that proliferate small arms, that even engage in the same trends and routes that even human trafficking across the broader Middle East is engaged in. So this is a tool to subvert the existing, pro-Western, stable status quo system in the heartland of the Middle East. And given all of the convulsion that we've been speaking about, those different sets of conflicts in the past few decades, this has been a group that's been helping the Islamic Republic punch well above its weight in the conventional foreign and security policy world, bolster the regime's deterrence. And if you remember, when NATO was established many years ago, the first Secretary General said that NATO was established to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. What the Axis of Resistance allows Iran to do is basically to keep the Islamic Republic of Iran on overdrive in the regime, to keep the Arab states down, to keep the Americans out, all with the goal of being able to act on their ideational threat of death to Israel.
So I'll go to Shadi now. Shadi, let's discuss how Tehran's long arm affects the larger Middle East and minorities across the Middle East. And we'll start now with your country of origin, Shadi, which is Syria. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad would not have survived the civil war in his own country without Hezbollah and Iran's support. What new vulnerable groups emerged following the civil war in Syria and around us?
Hi, and nice meeting you all again, and to all your distinguished guests. There are several minority groups that were affected tremendously by the presence of the Iranian militias, but mainly it was the Sunni population of Syria, which is, even though it's the majority of the population, the country is ruled by a minority that it's the Alawite in Syria, which is an offshoot of Shiism, but it's not exactly connected to the Iran branch of Shiism. So it's a little bit more liberal and different from the branch that is, presence in Iran and controlled by the mullahs in Iran. Now, Iranian interference in Syria has been for some time now, but it escalated after the Arab Spring. And it started early in February, actually, in 2011, even before the uprising in Syria started, which is descended into a civil war. And it started with experts that are trying to protect the regime from any protests or mass protests that they saw in other Arab countries. After the war escalated, we saw the interference of different militias from Iran. Specifically, and first, it was Hezbollah that engaged in areas along the Lebanese-Syrian border. Then we saw, as things escalated and the regime was very unstable and at risk, Iran brought in more heavy hitters. They brought us the Quds Force, which is directly linked to the Iranian regime, and of course the Revolutionary Guard. It's a branch of it. And then we saw more increased militias coming in from Iraq. We have several groups from Iraq, Badr Brigades, Abu Fadl al-Abbas, Najba, and others. And we also had militias recruited from Pakistan and Afghanistan, Zainabiyun, Fatimiyun. And we also saw recruitment of Syrian militias, even from tribal areas that is connected to Iran. All these forces at one point are estimated to be around 80,000 strong operating in Syria. But they had different roles. Some of them, especially Iraqi militias, was for securing of the route that is coming from Iran into the Mediterranean in Lebanon to smuggle weapons. So that was their area of control. Hezbollah controlled the areas along Lebanon-Syria's border. And also it has another task is drug smuggling. Drug smuggling is becoming the main source of finances for these militias, the Assad regime, and other terrorist actors in the area. And one of the important areas that these militias are interested is the corner that is between Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan, where it's heavily controlled by Hezbollah and other militias connected with Iran. And it's been used to smuggle drugs to Jordan and from there to other countries in the Gulf. But the main effect was on the local communities. The local communities had a lot of issues with Iranian interference, especially the Sunni Arab community and the Druze community. These two communities are very tribal and connected through family ties, and they didn't accept any foreign elements coming in and corrupting their use and spreading drugs even among local population. So that there was a huge backlash against this, but with no international attention, with no regional attention to this problem, these communities are left to defend themselves. There has been uprisings in both areas. The Druze community is still demonstrating and trying to protect itself, but with no help from anyone. I don't know where it's going to go. And that was a huge problem, and it's driving a lot of the youth to leave the area and try to find any safe place abroad, which is creating an additional issue of refugees and lack of use in these areas.
Thank you very much, Shadi. And I will now repeat my question to Eyal. So Eyal, Iran has been present in the Middle East on orbit for many years now, and let's just focus on one country which is specifically affected by the presence of Iran, which is Lebanon. So how has Iran's involvement in Lebanon by boosting Hezbollah further destabilized the already existing fragile and tense relationship between the various ethnic and religious groups?
Thank you, Carol, for this, and thank you for having me on this webinar. It is clear that Iran's involvement in Lebanon has been destabilizing for decades now, and this is part of the revolutionary strategy to topple down as many countries as they can, to fail them, to make them subordinate to their needs, and they do that throughout the region. Lebanon is probably the most prominent of those countries, but we see more of them. We see what happened in Yemen. We see what Iranian involvement in Syria has done, and we indeed see what the Iranian involvement in Iraq has done, which is maybe the most surprising given the history between Iraq and Iran and the war. As it comes to Lebanon, Iran's decision to bolster the Shiite population, which in more recent decades has been maybe the weakest and least influential faction of the Lebanese population. Iran has funded the Shiite population, has bolstered Hezbollah as a militia, indeed created a condition for Hezbollah to become the most powerful military faction in Lebanon itself, way more equipped, armed, and capable of the Lebanese armed forces themselves. In a situation where Hezbollah is a militia that owns a country, rather than a country that has the armed forces to protect them as the LAF were supposed to do. And this gives Hezbollah a very unique and dangerous condition where they can do whatever they want. They can fund and proliferate terror throughout the region and on the world, on Israel, but not only on Israel. Hezbollah has a very destabilizing role in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in any place that they feel that they can, of course, in Syria. And this is very, very profound and powerful because this allowed the Quds Force, of course, under Qasem Soleimani, when he was still around, to coordinate all of this work and to push it around to bolster the revolution. I think at the moment, the situation is that Lebanon is a country that has been once the prime of the region, the most westernized, the most modernized, the most open to the West, is no longer what it was. I'm not even sure that we can predict or envision a situation where Lebanon becomes again a country that is sustainable for its own people and prosperous. And given those conditions, Hezbollah has become the most powerful actor that actually called the shots on any one of the major issues that Lebanon needs to deal with.
Thank you very much, Eyal. Marjan, I'm turning to you. We spoke about Iran's effect outside of Iran, and let's drill down now to what's happening in Iran itself. The civil unrest in the Islamic Republic has continued since the Women Life Freedom Movement. What's the relationship between the protest movement in the country and the regime's proxy policies abroad? So we're talking about if there's a synergy, if there's a contradiction, if they affect one another.
Yes, it's an excellent question, Carol, and thank you for ADL for hosting this conversation. And it's nice to be among all these panel of experts. So yes, the civil unrest that has continued since September of 2022, when Mahsa Amini was murdered under regime's custody, definitely sparked an unprecedented mass protest in the country. That was also responded to with a mass crackdown, arrests, blinding of the protesters on the streets, the hitting them, shooting at them with pellet guns, and other, of course, torture as well as executions have continued in prisons, even though they have there's no longer that level of street level protests in Iran. The crackdown is still continuing. So as a result of the crackdown, the protests have taken different shape, and they're expressing their dissatisfaction with the regime through different modes of civil disobedience. The most recent and the most prominent form of civil disobedience that is being exhibited today in Iran is the significant lack of participation in the presidential elections that were just held just on Friday of last week, following a runoff elections that was so poorly participated in that no candidate could come out with a clear victory. So despite all of the incentives and all of the pressure for people to show up and participate in the elections, the Iranians chose the safest possible method at their disposal to express in a very strong but quiet voice their dismissal of the regime by not participating in the elections that they humorously refer to as a circus elections. So but the question is, okay, so it is undeniable that with over 50% of Iranians not participating in the elections, there is a significant population that has grievances with the government. But what do they want, and how does that relate to the topic of today's, which is the proxies? So to sum it up, there are three major areas of dissatisfaction among the citizens of Iran. Number one is that they are tired of the corruption and the mismanagement of the country's funds, that the Iranians want to have a life with dignity outside of the line of poverty, with a potential for progress and prosperity, just like we do. But their funds are being mismanaged, and they're being invested in all of the proxy interests that you all have discussed. And instead of investing and prioritizing in the citizens, they are investing and prioritizing their own agendas and malign agendas abroad. Number two is that the Iranian people are turning away from religion, Shia, Islam, and religion altogether. There were recent reports indicating the rise of religious atheism and also conversion among the Iranians. So by this cultural shift, Iranians are rejecting the Shia expansionist agenda of the Iranian regime, and they don't want to buy it anymore. Again, they are becoming more secular. They're converting to the original Zoroastrian faith that is native to their country, and even to Christianity as one of the most popular and fastest growing religions in the country. So they are rejecting Shia expansionism. And lastly, they are done with the regime and their policies altogether. For 40 years, every shortcoming in the country was blamed on external enemies. And there were promises of reform and conservative candidates coming and shifting things and improving things for them. But after 40 years and many cycles of elections, Iranians are coming to the conclusion that regardless of who is at the helm of presidency, the regime to its core is not going to support them. So regardless of whether the foreign policy for Iran is related to the proxies or not, the Iranians are rejecting their government and all of these policies in totality, with or without proxies. And also they are re-examining this myth of enemies being Israel and the United States, and entities that need to be destroyed.
Thank you very much, Marjan, for this thematic explanation about the protest movements and their aspirations. And Behnam, I'm turning to you now to talk about minorities, the vulnerable communities in Iran. So who are the most vulnerable communities in Iran today? Do ethnic and religious minorities in Iran stand a chance to live safely? Iran's nuclear race is an effort to guarantee the survival of the regime and impose its ideology on the region as a whole. And if Iran succeeds in obtaining nuclear weapons, what would that mean for vulnerable communities inside the country?
Well, with respect, Carol, let me start from the back end of your question, because if the Islamic Republic of Iran, if the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, if this country, if this regime, we should say, because there's a vast chasm between state and society, between national interest and regime interest when we're looking at a place like Iran, if the Islamic Republic is permitted or enabled or is somehow successful in developing and testing a deliverable nuclear weapon, this is really going to be a game changer, not just for those most vulnerable minorities. I'm not just talking ethnic minorities, I'm also talking religious minorities inside Iran, but I'm also talking about now the vast majority of the Iranian population, which since 2017 has pushed past all of this dialogue of reform, and through blood, sweat, tears, imprisonment, massive fines, harassment, bullying, exile, and death, has been paying the cost of saying that they want a government that represents their views, values, and interests. So if the Islamic Republic is permitted to do something which the world had promised and forsworn, and at least 4 or 5 different US presidents of different political parties, of different political persuasions, had said they would do everything to prevent, and the same goes for multiple prime ministers of the Jewish state in the Middle East, of Israel, it would be a game changer in terms of the power dynamics between that repressive state in Iran and that entire resisting apparatus that we call society in Iran. Not only would that change the power dynamic, but that would have a negative contagion or spillover effect in terms of the region, in terms of vulnerable communities in the region, empowering the Islamic Republic's already aggressive foreign and security policy apparatus, putting a wind beneath the wings of the different terror and proxy forces that exist in the axis of resistance, those that are intent on maintaining the Shiite hegemony in Iraq, those that are intent on doing population transfers and the reorienting of the sectarian and religious map, as Shadi talked about, particularly as what's going on in eastern Syria, and much worse. So this would be the short to medium term negative social and fallout of if the Islamic Republic of Iran gets a nuclear weapon. Now, going back to the first part of your question, who would be some of those most vulnerable communities even without a nuclear weapon? Well, one need only look at whom the Islamic Republic claims it represents. It claims to represent the Iranian population. Obviously, there's a huge chasm between national interest and regime interest, but also in the parliament, for example, in Iran, which we know has to go through this vetting process that's ultimately make sure that every candidate who passes is loyal to the supreme leader. They claim to have representation for Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians. But really, if you look closely at these political individuals who are appointed as the helms of these communities, these are more Potemkin villages used to display some sort of pseudo-tolerance that doesn't exist in practice. The issue, unlike with immense respect to other parts of the region, is not social interaction, Iranians of one political or religious disposition with these communities. It's actually the state's discriminatory policies against these communities, as well as communities that are not even represented in parliament in terms of religious views, such as the Baha'is, which are actually, I think, in terms of composition, larger than these three when you look at least official statistics coming out of Iran. That's at least the religious minority issue. Ethnically, the picture gets a lot more kaleidoscopic, a lot more quickly. Iran is home, like many other Middle Eastern countries, to empires that have turned into nation states over time. And they have the same center-periphery issues. Even though, Iran is synonymous with Persia for the past 900 years of Iranian history, with the exception of 2 dynasties, one in the early 1700s and one in the 1900s. For 900 years, Turkic-speaking peoples had been rulers of what you would call Iran or the Iranian plateau. So the picture gets much more kaleidoscopic, and that symbiosis or that synergy between the Turkic and the Persian elements has led to pushback by Kurdish elements in the past. And it's particularly why during the Women Life Freedom protests in 2022 to 2023, 2 of the most active areas had actually been the Southeast, which is home to both a sectarian and a religious population, which is the Sunni Baluch, as well as in the Western provinces, which are largely but not exclusively Kurdish.
Thank you very much, Behnam. And Marjan, Behnam kind of alluded to it somehow. How is the Iranian regime cynically using the vulnerable religious minorities, and what are the state mechanisms and the rhetoric they use to demonstrate support on one hand and control on the other hand?
I think the best way to summarize this relationship is manipulation. And it's conditional support. So, as Behnam mentioned, the 3 religious groups that they have considered as constitutionally approved religious groups in the country, the Jews, Christians, and the Zoroastrians, have representation in the Iranian parliament. But the representation is actually a mechanism of enforcement and repression. So in order to maintain their level of representation and second-class citizenship, which is in itself actually a privilege in Iran, where other religious minorities, as Ben said, the Gonabadi dervishes and the Baha'i population, the Baha'i population does not have any status of any sort in the constitution of the Iranian regime. So therefore, in order to maintain that second-class privilege, they need to abide by any requirement, any demand, any request that the government is imposing on them. And in return, they get to practice their religion, and they get to be left alone without regular harassment from the Iranian regime. But this goes beyond the religious populations. It also really expands to the ethnic groups. Just most recently in these elections, because it was so important for Khamenei to demonstrate an ambitious and a vibrant participation in the elections, they resorted to any possible incentive or threat in order to compel the minorities to participate in the elections. So the Baluch minorities that has already been so repressed, so persecuted over the years, the Black Friday was one of the bloodiest days in the history of the Baluch community, where following a Friday prayer service, the regime officials, they gunned down worshippers and protesters who were just there to express their spiritual and their opinions. And ruthlessly, children, men, women were killed. But in order to motivate them to participate in the elections, they threatened them with the cutting off of the electricity and water, that if you do not participate in a respectable way in this upcoming round of elections, we're going to cut you off. And of course, these people who have lost so much, who are already so deprived, they're more likely to participate, and the numbers demonstrated that. But the whole engineering of who got to be the candidate, who got to be branded as a reformist, and you know, the ethnic background of Pezeshkian, who is also a Turk, incidentally, like Behnam said, there is a history of Turks taking power or having dominance in the Iranian government. Khamenei himself is Azari of background and Turkish speaking, and as is Pezeshkian. So interestingly, one of the things to highlight is that Pezeshkian's 3 million vote margin largely came from the Turkish-speaking regions, Eastern Azerbaijan, Western Azerbaijan, and Ardabil, where those communities are represented. But we also saw significant participation and support for Pezeshkian from those minority regions, largely because of the threats and or the incentives and promises that they were giving them. The threats are real, and I don't judge the people who had to go and cast their ballots under duress. I really don't judge them. But I also want to tell those 50% of the people who did not participate in the elections that they are hurt. I could go on, but I think I can pause here.
Thank you very much, Marjan. Eyal, we're doing this webinar in a post-October 7th era, and we're talking about Iran and its effect on the region, which has been tremendous. But I think that we will be remiss if we don't mention the April 14th significant attack on Israel. Although now I have a question on the on-the-ground effect in Israel. So can you tell us about the Israeli perspective on the proxy threats and how it plays out in the bigger Iranian picture? And I mean, is there a real chance that Iranian influence could reach not only to Gaza, but also the West Bank, given the weakness of the Palestinian Authority and the secular Fatah movement on the one hand, and the strong Iranian backing of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad on the other? Will Palestinian nationalism become a religious movement?
So I think that the Iranian approach to weaken Israel from within is strong and profound, not only for religious reasons, but I think indeed for nationalistic revolutionary reasons. So we have evidence that been released recently on ongoing and even increasing efforts by the Iranians to ship arms, not only to Gaza, but also to the West Bank, and several of those attempts have been targeted and blocked. But of course, we need to be worried that if we've blocked some of them, maybe others have been successful and moved ahead. And Iran is increasingly trying to destabilize Jordan, which is across the border from the West Bank. And the less stable Jordan is, the more influence they can have on what's happening on the West Bank. Now, whether or not they're also trying to have a religious radicalization movement in the West Bank, probably so. Clearly, they're trying to increase the influence of Hamas, which will back them. But then it will be Hamas who's trying to radicalize the West Bank. I don't think that the Iranians in their strategy are trying to convert the religious factions of the Palestinians to being Shiite from their Sunni belief at the moment. I think they care less about the exact nuance of their religious affiliation, as long as they will follow the Iranian strategy and will continue to fight against Israel and to weaken it from within. So I think it is more a revolutionary effort than a pure religious Shiite effort, but it can be effective nonetheless. I mean, the fact that Iran has become the supporter of Hamas being a faction of Islamic Brotherhood, which, if we look at it only in Muslim terms, there is a historic clash between those two political Muslim opposing movements over centuries. So I think the Iranian motivation to weaken Israel is stronger than the Iranian motivation to support Shiites over Sunni, and this is the outcome that we see. To your questions about how this is viewed in Israel, we're very worried. So I think indeed we need to be worried that every attempt that Israel will do to try to normalize relationship with neighboring countries will find ourselves facing Iranian clear strategic attempts to prevent this. Clearly, my belief is that even if we never find intelligence suggesting that Iran ordered Hamas to start October 7, they are the major beneficiary of that. They were able to derail the normalization process with Saudi Arabia that clearly they saw as a strategic threat. And I think that they will do this every time that they have an opportunity to do so. This will have an impact also on potential political processes between Israel and the Palestinians. Israeli society, Israeli leadership are worried, should be worried, that a Palestinian entity in the West Bank will be influenced by Iran, radicalized, armed, trained, and funded to be an even stronger threat to Israel as we see it today. We always have to be cautious and cognizant that Iran is the ultimate spoiler of any normalization effort of Israel in the region. They've done this before, they will do this in the future. And this is why Iranian risk and threat on Israel is considered so strategic. It's not just the nuclear aspect that was talked before, and I think Behnam has described very, very carefully and accurately. If Iran goes nuclear, everything will be different than what we see today. But it's also in the everyday possibility and option of Israel in normalizing with our neighbors.
Thank you very much, Eyal. And I think that what we get from all of your perspectives is how Iran is manipulating the various proxies that it handles and playing around with their own cultural, religious, ethnic nuances to make their agenda fit the area. And I'm going back to you, Shadi. Now, currently, what forces are the Islamic Republic using to control areas in Syria? And what is also the role of the Assad regime in the Islamic Republic project in the area?
So I'll go to the second part of your questions. The Assad regime is very crucial to the Iranian project in the area. If you look at what was mentioned before of the force of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria used to control Lebanon, and Lebanon is like most of its borders is with Syria. So most of the now shipments going to Hezbollah be directed at Israel are coming through Syria. And where they are coming from, they're using the route from Iraq that is going through the Syria into Lebanon. Also, Syria has enabled Iran to have a third front with against Israel, which is the Golan Heights. Even though there was an agreement between Israel and Russia about not putting Iranian forces, unfortunately, Iranian forces and militia are dressing up as Syrian army units and are there, and everyone knows that. And they're embedded also inside civilian areas. So that's the third front. The other thing is destabilizing the only remaining country that is not controlled by Iranian proxy, which is Jordan. Jordan is being flooded by drugs. Also, it's being flooded by weapons. There is weapon smuggling operations that are coming from Syria into Jordan. What are they going to be used for? We wait and see. Maybe it's for destabilize Jordan internally. Maybe they will be smuggled to the West Bank, which has a long border with Jordan. So there is so many things that if the Assad regime didn't control Syria, that wouldn't be available to Iran. Iran would only have the port of Beirut or the airport of Beirut to get shipments there, and this thing can be cut at any time if there is like a strong government or something or a backlash from its involvement in Syria or a war with Israel. But now you can't do anything because the floodgates are open. No one engaged in trying to cut these routes and take Iran out of Syria by enabling the Assad regime to stay. And also now the moves is to stabilize the Assad regime, and somehow people thinking that if he would kick the Iranians out. Unfortunately, things have changed since 12 years ago. The Assad regime cannot kick the Iranians. The Iranians can kick the Assad regime and kill Assad. Probably they're the only people who can do that and do what they did to the Yemeni president when he went against the Houthis. He was killed. So now we have another proxy regime that is working, even though probably the Assad regime don't want that, but they have no choices. The Iran regime is infiltrated all structure of government, all structures of the military and intelligence and civilian life. So it's going to be very, very hard to get Iran out of Syria without getting rid of the Assad regime.
Thank you very much, everyone, for all your input here. And now I have a question to all of you, to each and every one of you. So in an attempt to be more proactive and really do something to change the situation, can you tell us about how we can be better allies to the vulnerable groups threatened by the Islamic Republic's proxies in the Middle East? And what should change in a post-October 7th world? And we'll start with you, Marjan. Please unmute yourself.
All right. So I think the nuclear issue is really a pivotal issue that should be brought back to the forefront of conversations. But in the case of the reopening of nuclear negotiations, I think we need to learn the lessons of the JCPOA and learn from the failures and avoid the mistakes of the past. By that, I mean that Islamic Republic's malign behavior and proxy activity in the region needs to be put on the table along with the human rights issues. Those issues were deliberately left off the table, and now we see after thousands of lost lives, after major destabilization of the region and an increased encroachment of the regime's hand in the region, we see that this was a mistake and perhaps an avoidable one. So I think that the proxies and the human rights issues need to be put back with equal level of importance at the negotiation tables in the future. But then bringing our attention back to human rights issues in Iran, I think it is important to avoid the tendency to see Iran's minorities as ethnic separatists. And while we are talking about these regional influences and the arm of the Islamic Republic among different ethnic factions, I think it is important to recognize that in Iran, all of the ethnic minorities are still Iranians. And given the opportunity to prosper and live with dignity and equal rights, they would want to stay in Iran as part of within the Iranian borders. And any policies to separate and to encourage separatist ideations and practices could only cause more harm to them and to the region as well. And then lastly, I think that when we think about these regions, we have to avoid the racism with which we dismiss the violence in the region as part of an endemic cultural behavior of that group. I don't think that human beings are endemically culturally conditioned to treat each other with violence in this respect. And I think to see that and to believe that of the Iranian people is itself a racist ideology that I think we need to avoid.
Thank you very much, Marjan. Shadi, how can we be better allies to the vulnerable minorities in the Middle East?
Well, actually, I was involved in a project called Good Neighbor that would bringing aid from the Golan Heights into southern Syria when the Assad regime and Iran and Russia weren't in control of it. And I saw a lot of transformation in the life and the attitude of people in southern Syria who had no connection with Israel for such a long time. And I went to, wrote an article about it. One place in Syria that worked. We had this society that was functioning by itself, controlled itself. And things were progressing very good. Minorities were feeling happy. There was Christian minorities there that are good. Even the Druze communities were feeling better. But this all was destroyed when the Assad regime, with the help of Russia and Iran, invaded. I don't have a magical solution for it. But I need to understand who are the people who are not willing to do anything for these minorities in these communities, even though they pretend to. I think that we have to look at the role of Russia, of helping Iran, empowering it there. And this is a very destructive role. Unfortunately, in US policy and sometimes regional policy, they look at Russia as a taming factor on the power of Iran. I don't see it this way. I see there is no contradictions with the aim of Russia, of Iran. Iran is on it for the long-term strategy of controlling this area. Russia in it for, having strategic basis. So it's not contradictory. They can work with each other. And some people see that Iran is a control factor against Sunni extremism, which I don't think so as well. I think the Iranian regime created the atmosphere for this Sunni extremism, then exploited to benefit of it and scaring the Western country with it. If we don't understand these things and we don't realize the destructive things that Russia and Iran are doing in this region, we can't help these minorities. We first have to understand these destructive factors, and then I think minorities will be helped by taming this aggressiveness by these two countries in the Middle East.
Thank you so much, Shadi. And in the name of the task force, I feel that one thing that we do and we should continue to do is really just because those minorities, as we said, are vulnerable and weakened and marginalized, and they can usually do not speak for themselves and do not have a voice in the public conversation. We should help and be the voice as much as we can in the most authentic way for those communities. Eyal, to you with the same question. And also from an Israel perspective, how can we be better allies to those vulnerable communities?
So first of all, I think that the communities within Iran and their prospect of gaining more power over their lives, I think it's crucial for Iran itself and for the region. And I think that supporting the minorities in Iran is very important. And the programs that we need to do on this must be ongoing. The fact that every time there is protest of minorities in Iran, they seek support from the Western world and see so little support. Even during the Amini protest, which I think there was more empathy to it. But we look back at the massacres in 2019. We look back at the Green Movement in 2009. When the people of Iran do not feel the support of the international community in their fight and struggle for their rights, they actually don't stand a chance in putting their heads up. And ultimately, maybe this is the only way to change Iran's strategic trajectory of being so dangerous, not only to Israel, but indeed for the entire region. And with that, I want to echo what Mariam said before about the nuclear program, because if there is a single thing that all of us need to be the most worried about, is that everything that we've said today will only bolster, increase, and be more dangerous should Iran become nuclear and possess the nuclear capability. And as Benham said before, I mean, the pledge of so many American presidents and the responsibility of the international community to prevent that are so profound and clear. And there will be no excuses should that happen. What would the leaders of the world say after they've tried and attempted and said time and again that they will use all of their means of power to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapon? What will they say? We tried and we failed. What does that mean for world order? And I think that these two things, the need to give the Iranian people a hope, and on the other side to make sure that as long as the revolutionary regime is in power, they cannot possess this means of mass destruction. Those are maybe the key things that we need to emphasize all of our efforts in the upcoming future. And time is running out, because indeed it is imminent that the Iranian regime can do this and is approaching the status of threshold state. And this is very dangerous, again, not only for Israel, I think for the region and for the entire world.
Thank you very much, Eyal, for addressing it from a strategic perspective. And last but not least, Benham, what should change in a post-October 7th world, not only from a strategic perspective, also the microaggressions against vulnerable communities. How do we help them?
Well, we could go on, unfortunately, for a very long time, much longer than I think this webinar has, on the things that need to change in the Middle East and that need to change in Western policy towards the Middle East post-October 7th. But let me just enumerate three things very quickly. One is do no harm. Two is understand the convergence between strategy and values, particularly when you talk about, the people of the Middle East versus the states of the Middle East. And number three is to actually develop a regional policy. And let me enumerate and put a little bit of meat on the bone on each one very briefly. Number one, do no harm. The region is littered, and I'm sitting here in Washington speaking right now, littered with US-owned goals, strategic missteps, a misalignment of ways, means, and ends. And unfortunately, many of our adversaries, like the Islamic Republic of Iran, like the Russian Federation, like the Assad regime, like many of this constellation and terror of proxy forces, have been able to capitalize on our mistakes. So we should not be giving them the ground to make any of these mistakes. And some of these mistakes are even simple to make. So even rhetorically guarding against them, making sure that we're talking about the Islamic Republic as being the driver of this instability rather than Iran. Little rhetorical things will go a much, much longer way. Number two is, understanding the convergence of strategy and values. You don't really get too many instances in the Middle East to marry your head and your heart. There's very few places that you can actually do that. And in fact, one of the reasons U.S. foreign policy has been so confounded really in the past century towards the region is this divergence of strategy and values. What we have today with the human rights situation, particularly in Iran, particularly in Syria, particularly in other parts of the region, is an opportunity to right size and course correct that and not to forsake that opportunity. So for someone like me who works on Iran policy, as much as I would support a resurrection or a resumption of maximum pressure on the regime, it's clear that we need another prong as well. And that's why FTD and one of our friend and partner organizations, Nufti, and many others in Washington have been calling for maximum support towards the Iranian people as well. And we put meat on the bone as to what that actually entails, to have a policy towards the regime, but also have a policy towards the people as well. And then last but not least, number three, a regional policy. I don't think, again, sitting here in Washington, the U.S. has a real policy towards Iraq. I think our policy in Syria is, hamstrung together in an attempt now to resurrect or stabilize part of the Assad regime due to some of the flawed assumptions and thinking that Shadi enumerated, and this ability to treat one or to see one thing as a check when in reality it's an element of force in our adversaries' quiver. We tend to tie things together, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and not really understand a lot of the local drivers there. So here I would say have a regional policy, understand that there is a regional ground game that the U.S. has really been absent from for a very long time. And if we do want to stand for these minorities, but also stand for these minorities and their brothers and sisters and compatriots who are also repressed by failed states and authoritarian governments, we need to be doing things that support the livelihood of all of these individuals. And that begins with a better policy towards the states that repress them. So, a fundamental need to see and have a regional ground game is going to be crucial here to doing something with all of the rhetoric that we've espoused that we wish to act on.
Thank you very much, Behnam, and thank you all for a wonderful conversation, Marjan, Shadi, Eyal, and Behnam. It's been really a pleasure. And let me just add before I pass it on to Tuba. We've talked here about how minorities in the Middle East are affected by the Islamic Republic's agenda, rhetoric, actions, and so on. And one thing that stands out to me as an ADL professional is that the rule that says that it starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews, really applies to Iran, because this is the leading state-sponsored anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the world, an anti-Western agenda, an anti-American agenda, and so on. And it affects minorities within Iran. It affects minorities that had to do with proxies in the region. And we're seeing a pattern here that we all recognize, and it affects minorities in different ways, but definitely something that ADL will continue to fight as ADL and through the task force. So thank you all very much, and I now hand it over to Tuba.
At this time, our webinar is finished. Let me join Carol in thanking all of our panelists. Please stay tuned for updates from ADL and from ADL's Task Force on Middle East Minorities. And please subscribe to ADL's YouTube channel and feel free to share our content. Thank you for joining. Have a great day.